All right, kids, we're heading into North Chicago off of crossing Skokie Highway over the tracks. Basically, North Chicago is just like a big box. You got the Navy base to the southeast. Straight directly east is Lake Michigan. And the city goes all the way north of 10th Street. Really just a big box. Yeah, a lot of people, they call it no-go. I don't like that. I think it's really disrespectful. I don't say that. A lot of good people in North Chicago. So hopefully this video will shed a little light on the early history of North Chicago, showing the respect North Chicago deserves. Hey kids, I don't know what you think about when you think of North Chicago. I don't know what comes to your mind. I don't know, maybe your school, grandma's house, your own house. It makes sense. I'll tell you what I think about. I think about the early days of North Chicago and where it all began. Down here on the lakefront and behind me in the cemetery. Yeah, kids, this is St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery, one of the oldest cemeteries in all of Lake County. Buried here, Eastern European immigrants, Irish immigrants, people from Germany, Italy, all these folks here laying at rest, they built North Chicago. North Chicago was built on work. And the people here in this cemetery, these tombstones stand in their honor. All right, kids, that's St. Mary's Cemetery. We're going to head out. We're actually going to try to get down closer to the lakefront. Back in the olden days of North Chicago, that's where all the factories and mills were. And all these immigrants that are buried here, they're the ones that worked in these factories and mills. So we're going to go check out the location. So let's go. Yeah, I consider myself walking on hallowed ground here, kids. This is where it all began in North Chicago, believe it or not. This big, huge, empty expanse of land was at one point full of factories and mills, making all different kinds of products for the American public. First one actually came from Massachusetts. The Washburn and Moen Company, they soon changed their name to American Steel and Wire. They actually brought all their own workers in first, but soon they started hiring and recruiting people from the area. And North Chicago soon became one of the meccas for manufacturing, especially hardware products, chemicals, you name it. At first, the companies, they would build their company housing up here on the ridge here. This used to be lined with homes. But eventually, the workers of these companies, they moved into the neighborhoods. The accountants, the salespeople of the company first, they had the money to buy and build homes. But eventually, the laborers moved up there and purchased homes on company credit. Yeah, North Chicago would have been nothing without a rail line. In fact, in the early days, in the late 1800s, trains like this would just roar right past where North Chicago is right now and get up to Waukegan. But that company I mentioned earlier, Washburn and Moen, they saw the opportunity in the open space on the lakefront, decided to bring their factory in from Massachusetts and build by a train depot. That's how North Chicago began, right there. Huge businesses followed, built their property on the lakefront similar to these here in Waukegan. American Motors, Johnson Motors, Abbott Laboratories in 1922. And all these people needed places to live. So the neighborhoods in North Chicago started to grow. All right, 13th and Adams. Yep, walking south on Adams, one of the oldest streets in North Chicago. Back in the early days of North Chicago, when it officially became a city, this is where a lot of the European immigrants would come live. All he had to do was walk down the end of the street, hang a left, go down where all the factories were off the lake. This right here was primarily a German-Irish neighborhood. And you know, they brought the religions with them. Churches were built nearby. Schools started popping up. Your typical American family growing up here, working hard, putting in long days. North Chicago. One of those families that lived in North Chicago was the Knar family. The dad was Jacob. He had a daughter named Julia. They actually attended this church, Holy Rosary Catholic Church, in the early 1900s. His daughter went to North Chicago High School, and in those days they actually had to go to Waukegan to attend school. She married a Polish guy. He actually owned a butcher right up 14th over that way. So it's just a typical family, but a good example of what was going on in the early days of North Chicago in the neighborhoods. In the early days of North Chicago, a lot of the kids went to the Catholic schools that were built around the churches, but soon the town grew and other schools started popping up all around the neighborhood. Right here is the old Lindbergh School. Pretty sure it was built in the 20s. This is one of your typical buildings. If you look through North Chicago, you'll find a lot of old schools that we don't use anymore. But back in the heyday, in the 20s and 30s and 40s, this building was packed with students. So students, the neighborhood started to get bigger. The population of North Chicago started to increase. And actually businesses started to push into the city. So let's go take a look over at Commonwealth Avenue, and we can see where some of the old business of North Chicago started. All right, kids. Heading east on Martin Luther King over the tracks here is the old industrial area of North Chicago. Business started moving in here in the 30s and 40s and 50s. More jobs to be had. 2500 Commonwealth Avenue. Back in the 1920s, a giant company took over this property, 40 acres. Chicago Hardware and Foundry. In fact, this company became so big, it employed over 2,000 people at any given time. That brings up a key point in North Chicago's history, kids. North Chicago needed more workers. At the same time, there was this key event taking place in American history called the Great Migration. Hundreds and thousands of African Americans started moving up from the South. They stopped in Chicago, Detroit, northeastern cities. They went everywhere. But some of them kept going north and landed in North Chicago. They started filling up all the jobs in this industrial area here. This whole block goes on for a couple miles. It was full of factories and plants and mills in the 40s and 50s and 60s. It was a great place to have a job and raise a family. At least that's what a lot of the African American families thought. Coming from the South, they were fleeing segregation, laws that kept them separate, laws that discriminated against them. So they're just hoping for better opportunities and better treatment in the North. When they got to North Chicago, they did get a lot of good jobs, but a really sad chapter in North Chicago opened up. Dugdale Avenue, kids, heading towards Argonne. This whole area here, this whole big giant corner, was a giant slum in North Chicago's history. All those people that came up from the South to look for jobs in North Chicago, they were forced to live in a certain area of the city. They had no running water, no sewers. When they used the restroom, they had to use an outhouse. This is one of the sad chapters in North Chicago's history. Something worth taking a look at. There's other things about North Chicago too that we can learn about. We can't forget about Great Lakes Naval Station, established in 1911. And we can't forget about historic Sheridan Road. But those are stories for another day. All right, kids, I hope you enjoyed our little history lesson of the early days of North Chicago. There's a lot to learn about this town, so hopefully you'll take some time to do a little research yourself as I'm working on part 2. A lot of good families here in North Chicago. I should know. I've taught a lot of their kids. Have a good day.